that is this meeting today. Some of you, many of you, I think, actually probably have attended or at least seen the presentation that Tim did just a little under a year ago on the results of the baseline for the impact evaluation for the PRIME study, or the PRIME project rather. And as one part of that, he mentioned this captivating notion of trigger indicators that were going to be used to understand when a shock was starting to take place within a community that would then trigger a host of regular context monitoring to try to better understand how populations were dealing with or the extent of their resilience to the shocks that they were facing. So this topic has been a beautiful confluence of several aspects that the interest group is really interested in, from a case study itself all the way down to actually thinking about how you can use something like trigger indicators to trigger some broader questions or answers to broader questions on resilience capacities. So before I introduce Tim, who probably needs no introduction in this room, I just wanted to note the protocol for the meeting. Because we have such a broad online audience, we ask that when the time comes for question and answer, you speak loudly. Tim will make an effort for those of you in the wings, especially who might not, whose voice might not get picked up by the mic, to repeat your questions, but please orate to the masses who are near and far, not necessarily in this room. Because of the interest of time, I ask that if you have questions of clarification on something you see on a slide, please feel free to ask. But otherwise, we will leave as much time as possible for Q&A at the end. So write it down, hang on to it, and we promise we'll get to you just as soon as we can. And then just to note again that we will end at 3 o'clock today. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the call over to Tim Frankenberger, the president of Untitled International, who's going to walk us through the ins and outs of the first round of context monitoring from the PRIME project. So Tim, thanks so much.
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. I just want you to know that this has been a long trip for me. I actually went from Tucson, Arizona to Thailand for a resilience meeting for Asia, and then I flew to Nairobi for more work on looking at resilience actually that FAO was supporting, and then I flew here for a meeting yesterday with FuseNet on resilience, and now this meeting. So my family's wondering if I even still live in Tucson, but a little jet lag. So if I don't sound too clear, or if I don't, this is a good reason. So Laura already said that this monitoring work that we're doing is related to trying to understand whether or not a program, this Pastoral Area Resilience Improvement and Market Expansion Project, or the PRIME, which is Feed the Future funded, is actually having an impact on resilience for the households that it's actually working with in the pastoral areas of Ethiopia. So it's working in the Afar region, the Somali region, and the Borana region of Ethiopia. And so this impact study doesn't focus on all 3 of those regions, it's focusing on 2 of those regions, the Somali region and the Borana region. Not because we weren't interested in Afar, but because we didn't have enough money to do an impact for that whole area. So what was interesting about this is that the baseline tried to capture what we saw were key capacities that households and communities had to absorb shocks or to adapt to shocks or transform to shocks so that they could meet certain well-being outcome measures, food security being one that was important, but we were also looking at nutrition indicators and some wealth indicators as well. We also knew that if you really are going to understand resilience, you have to actually see what households and communities do when a shock actually hits. You can't just ask them what they used to do from the past, but it would be great to actually watch as the shock unfolds, what are the behaviors, the activities, the interventions, the responses of households and communities to actually deal with those shocks. And so that's what this interim monitoring system that we set up was supposed to do. We wanted to kind of monitor certain kinds of indicators that tell us that things are getting worse, certainly past certain thresholds, and then that tells us that we need to go in and start collecting data. Now, we had a panel, it was a panel set of data, so we had a household survey population of 3,200, which we drew a sample of 430 from that. And this, the advantage of that was we didn't have to go back and recollect all of that data on demography, all the data on the different kinds of strategies or assets that people had. We had all that already. And the advantage of doing a kind of a light questionnaire that takes 15 minutes to collect rather than 2.5 hours is that you can go back repeatedly and ask questions and actually track change over time with regards to people's responses. And you wanted some kind of indicators on food security that also changed fairly rapidly so that you could track whether or not people were going up or down on food security over that time frame. So with that background, the two areas that we are working in, this is the Borana region here in the south of Ethiopia, and then the Jijiga area where the Somalis are in that part of Ethiopia. So that was in two different places. These are two different agroecological zones. The areas in the Jijiga area are agro-pastoralists and non-pastoralists. And the area in the Borana region are primarily pastoralists and some agro-pastoralists. So it's important to understand those livelihood strategies as we talk about how they actually cope with these shocks over time. So this IE baseline that we did, we carried that out in November, December 2013, and we always intended to have 2 rounds of this monitoring system. The first round, 1 year after the baseline, to kind of see, how people are actually managing shocks. To be fair to the project, we knew that the interventions probably hadn't been implemented long enough to really make a difference. That's why we're going to do another round this year, starting now. So by now, we should start seeing the project actually having an influence on people's strategies to manage shocks and stresses more effectively. So we waited till, okay, the other thing that's important is we used 3 different types of information to try to determine whether the shock was happening. The project itself had its own early warning system where they had a number of trigger indicators that they were monitoring every 2 weeks in all the locations that they were implementing the program. In addition, we were drawing on FuseNet and a lot of the FuseNet Outlook data that was being collected every month. And then we were also drawing on the information that the government of Ethiopia was actually providing with regards to rainfall and other things. And then we had satellite imagery that we were also tracking. Now, because we had panel data, we actually had the GPS coordinates for all the households, so we could actually really zoom in on where this remote sensing data could be most applicable. So we used the data that was coming from Princeton. They actually, it's within half a kilometer in terms of accuracy, so it's pretty, it's not bad in terms of being able to track real climate data, or at least weather data, in those areas. So one of the things that we've been saying in the resilience community for a while is that we need to be sensitive to the resilience dynamics. We need to be watching how people actually are responding to these shocks. What do they do first? What do they do second? What do they do third? If you just measure things at the beginning and at the end of a program, you really don't understand the dynamic of this relationship between shocks and stresses and people's actual responses to those things. So we've always said you need to collect this data more frequently so that we can understand the pathways of dependency. So there's 2 pathways that we're trying to capture in this study. One pathway is the shock and the downstream effects of those shocks. The second pathway is the actual people's responses and their responses over time to these downstream effects. So you're looking at 2 different pathways of the shocks and pathways of the behavior responses. The thing that's also important here is that if you look at the responses carefully, you should be able to determine which interventions are more likely to have an effect on people managing the shock more effectively. And I'll come back to that when we actually look more at the analysis. So you want to have this kind of data actually feed back into your program so that you can say, okay, these things look like they're helping people manage more effectively. Maybe we should put more investment in those areas. And so we had a long dialogue with the project after we collected the data, and basically we pointed out, certain kinds of things would be more important to be looking at, and it was easy for them to understand the kinds of interventions they were actually engaging in, how they relate to those different kinds of capacities that are important. So there were two pieces in terms of methods, there were two pieces of data that we were trying to collect. In addition to all that shock data, we were interested in a quantitative instrument that was very short, easy to administer. It only took 15 minutes. And what it did was it asked people what kinds of shocks they were exposed to, and then how they were responding to those shocks, and then what were some of the well-being outcome measures that we could capture, like diet diversity, as well as HAIS perception score for household food security. Did I get that right? HFIAS. HFIAS, that's right. I can never get that acronym right. So we also had a qualitative piece. We wanted to actually understand from the communities themselves, how were they managing these shocks and stresses as a group? It wasn't just how our households managing it, but we wanted to see if communities themselves were managing it and what was happening over time in those communities. So we had focus group discussions and key informant interviews to help capture that. Okay, so I've already talked about why we want to have these high-frequency things. There were several research questions we were trying to answer with this study. The first one is, what are the downstream impacts of shocks on households' experience, and how did the incidence of these impacts evolve over time? So, sometimes we kind of get sector focused in our understanding of shocks. So if we're climate change guys, we will focus on the drought. If we're economists, we'll focus on the economic negative impacts. If we're livestock people, we might want to be more focused on the diseases. If we're peace-building people, we'll focus more on the conflict. But in fact, these are all interrelated. They all actually, what was interesting about this study is the drought triggered all these other downstream effects. And so the drought triggered an economic problem, it triggered a livestock disease problem, it triggered a water shortage pasture problem, which led to people moving into other tribal groups areas, which created a conflict problem. So these things are all interrelated. So when people talk about, well, I'm only interested in economic shocks, or I'm only interested in conflict, you have to understand this dynamic, and you capture it very well by monitoring it over time. So we're also interested in the coping strategies that households employ to deal with the shocks, and how these change over time. So what happens first when people are managing the shock? What happens second? What happens if it's 2 droughts in a row? Okay, so we were very interested in how people were actually trying to manage this over time. Did they turn to negative coping strategies at first, or did they move into that much later? Did social capital pull them through the first several months, but then it started to erode over time? All of these questions is what we were trying to investigate by looking at this over collecting data 6 times in a row. We were also interested in whether the severity of the exposure to the shock had a huge effect on people's ability to recover. So in the baseline, it was very clear to us that the pastoralists were much more resilient than the agro-pastoralists when there wasn't a great big shock. But what was interesting, when you actually started looking at the effect of the severity of the shock, it had a big impact on people's ability to manage it. And so it kind of reversed, and I'll come back to what happened in terms of the reversal of who's more resilient in the face of those shocks. We were interested in whether these resilience capacities, which we've been hypothesizing as being really important, how did they affect people's ability to protect themselves from the shock? Our study from the baseline basically said that these capacities matter, that absorptive capacity, your ability to manage shocks in the short term, adaptive capacity, your ability to actually proactively change what you do so that you're managing that change over time. So for example, a lot of the work that you guys do on climate smart agriculture would be part of that. And transformative capacity. Were there changes in the institutional environment, the enabling conditions that enable people to manage that shock more effectively? So we're basically interested in those three types of capacities and how do they influence people's ability to manage these shocks. The other thing we're interested in, and this is the new thinking that was coming out, was we realized that it wasn't enough just to know about people's capacities. You need to know something about responses. Even if you have the capacity to do well, it doesn't mean you will do well. I mean, how many PhDs do we know that are still unemployed out there, you know? So the point here is that capacities matter, but responses are important. And if you don't understand how people are actually responding, then you really won't understand how they actually affect their outcomes. So really getting a good focus on response is what this monitoring system allowed us to do. And we wanted to know what the relationship was between people's capacities and these responses. Did it make a difference? Was it preventing people from turning to these negative coping strategies that would have a long-term downstream effect on their ability to recover in the future? So in essence, the main objective of this was to try to create real-time data that allowed us to watch shocks in progress, how people actually respond to those shocks, and then whether or not those responses enable people to still maintain certain levels of well-being in the face of those shocks. If they're resilient, they should maintain certain levels of food security or actually improve in food security. If they're not resilient, you should start seeing a downward pathway in that food security. So, wait, did I just show that? Am I going the wrong way? Okay. Okay. So, I want to make one more point on this slide. When we're measuring resilience, there's three major things, actually four major things that you have to have at a minimum. One, you have to have a good measure of the shocks and stresses that people are exposed to. And you want to try to capture that both from using objective external information as well as people's own perception of that. Both of those are critical, and I'll come back to why that people's perception is so important. Second, you want to know something about the capacities that people have to manage those shocks and stresses. And so we have a large list of variables that we track for this, but we're hoping over time as we collect data in more and more locations, we'll be able to narrow that list down and be more parsimonious in what we actually choose. And the third thing, you have to measure some kind of well-being outcome, whether that be food security or nutrition or some kind of income measure, health measure. The important thing is that you have to understand resilience in relationship to some outcome. Resilience is a means to an end. If you are able to manage those shocks and stresses effectively, you should see positive or at least not a downward trend in those well-being outcome measures. So you need all three sets. So there's no one set of indicators that we're saying this is what resilience indicators. It's all of these things that you have to actually track. So essentially the study used a number of external data resources to map out the progression of the 2014-15 drought. So as I said before, we relied on FuseNet, food security outcome stuff. We had the prime trigger indicator data, which is very location specific, but also collected every 2 weeks. We had this rainfall data collected by the Ethiopian government, and then we had satellite remote sensing data from the African Flood Drought Monitor. And I guarantee you it's free. All you have to do is go to the internet. You can find it on the internet, and if you know what your geospatial coordinates are, you can actually track things like rainfall, soil moisture, NDVI data from that satellite imagery. And it's great. I mean, it's one of the best things I've ever seen. It was free out there. So essentially what we found was that in both these areas that we were working in, drought unfolded in two waves. So there was one shock that hit they were the first rainy season, and then it happened again in Borana. So you had two waves of drought. So the first one corresponded between March and September 2014. This is actually between the baseline data in the first round of the interim monitoring. So that was one phase we were looking at, 2 points in time. And then the second phase happened from October 2014 to April 2015. That was the second drought phase. So we were actually able to see what happened as households responded to the first drought and then how they were dealing with the second drought. So this kind of illustrates these two waves. So this is the rainfall data. You can see that there's this huge dip both in Jijiga. Jijiga is in the red and the Borana is in the blue. And you can see that there is two waves here. So you had this wave and then you had this wave. These correspond with the bimodal rainfalls in these areas. So the box that you see there, that's actually the 6-month period where we actually did the interim monitoring activities. So every month for 6 months. Again, if we looked at soil moisture, you can see these two waves again. And if we look at the NDVI data, it also has two waves. So it was important for us to actually being able to, so everything was lining up. The satellite imagery was lining up with the trigger indicators and the fuse network. Everything was lining up. Also, people's perception about what was happening was lining up with this. So we knew that we had a pretty good idea that the droughts were occurring. We also knew that if we track what people are responding to, we could see whether or not these coping strategies eroded over time. So during the initial wave of the drought, the first rains, the Ghana and Borana and the Dira and Jijiga, it failed in both regions. So we're starting out kind of in the same playing field where both regions are dealing with very significant abnormal precipitous drops in soil moisture and vegetation coverage. Water and pasture shortages became significant. Sea oil prices started to drop because people's crops failed. They were having to import food from outside, so the prices were going up. People's animals had diseases, so they were trying to sell their animals off as fast as they could. That meant there was this huge influx of animals into the market with prices going up on the cereal because there's not enough, animal prices going down, created this huge difference in terms of trade for people in those areas. Many areas were both ended up being priority 1 nutrition hotspots because malnutrition rates were going up dramatically as well, particularly for acute malnutrition. So what was happening was with no milk for the animals, the milk, which was primary important food for the children in the area, they weren't getting any milk, and so now we started seeing nutrition actually get worse in the area over time. So the second wave evolved differently in the Borana region and the Jijiga region. The second wave in Borana actually was also a failure. It had a huge negative downward trend, whereas in Jijiga it did not fail. It was actually fairly normal rainfall. And so what we saw then was you see different pathways happening in these two regions. In Borana, when the second rains failed, that lack of water and lack of pasture actually reached very critical levels, and so we start seeing people migrating out of the area. We start seeing cross-border conflicts start to increase because they're moving into northern Kenya to try to capture more water and fodder. So conflict was going up. We're also seeing people more and more dependent on humanitarian assistance. 50% of the households were starting to say, we need food aid or we need cash to help us get through this period. So they were expecting sometime from one of the programs, whether it was PSNP or some of the other NGOs that are working here in the area, to actually provide some kind of assistance to help them manage this. The second rains didn't fail in the Jijiga area, and so when we look at the prime trigger indicators and the FuseNet indicators, they essentially reported that the water was returning, the pasture was starting to come back, return to normal. We start seeing normal harvests. So it looked like Jijiga was not exposed to the same level of drought as the Borana region. But what the advantage of trying to use all these different data sources is key here, because the remote sensing data told us that even though favorable conditions were starting to return, there was a sharp drop-off in soil moisture and vegetation coverage soon after when the rains came. And so they were still not fully recovered from the first drought. The thing was so bad the first time that it still didn't lead to a positive recovery. And so people near the end of that rainy season, we're then back to bad conditions again. So overall, Varana faced more severe drought conditions through these 2 drought waves, but the climate shock that happened the first time in Jijiga still put households under further stress. And so I think we were talking about this yesterday about kind of the downstream effects of one shock. It actually can be felt a long time in the future. Okay, so as I said before, what we see in the Varana region is that the downstream effects of the shock of the drought, livestock and crop diseases were going up. We see food price inflation because of this negative terms of trade going on in the markets, increasing prices of inputs, particularly medicines for diseased animals were going up dramatically. In Jijiga, again, which are primarily agro-pastoral and non-pastoral groups, again, we see livestock or crop diseases going up. We see food price inflation, but very bad harvests associated with, because there are more farmers up there, and you start seeing negative impacts on the harvest. So the downstream effect of the drought, and particularly on prices in the market, was very significant. So we had a lot of economic shock that was happening in association with the downstream effects. So this is what really put people in hard times. It wasn't just being able to manage the lack of water and lack of pasture, but it was not being able to afford the food that they had to buy as a result of their animals dying off or getting poor prices for their animals in the market. And as I said before, conflict started to go up as well. It increased dramatically, particularly in the Varana region. Qualitative data was really nice because it actually gave us a much more deep picture of what was happening within these households, how they were coping with these shocks and stresses. And really, it had both a positive picture and a negative picture. So in the beginning, in the first several months of the monitoring, we see people pulling together, helping each other out, sharing food, sharing animals, the clan leaders, making sure there's redistribution of things going on. But after the 3rd month, 4th month of the second drought in Varana, it was difficult for people to continue to maintain those safety nets. And so even the clan leaders, which are necessary for the redistribution, were forced to leave the area because their animals were starting to die off too. And so when the clan leaders left, the governance system broke down, and the redistribution for everybody else broke down. So that's when the very poor actually got much worse off as a result. So positive and negative coping strategies. Reducing food consumption is a negative coping strategy, and it was one of the most important ones that everybody followed. Pulling kids out of school is another negative coping strategy, that you're sacrificing future human capital to deal with the problem today. Getting into debt, borrowing money, from a money lender at very high interest rates. One of the things that happened, those of you who remember a drought that happened in Malawi back in the early 90s, even though there wasn't another drought after that, it took households 5 years to recover from that drought, just to get out of the debt that they had accumulated. So these use of negative coping strategies started to increase over time. People started to turn to these negative coping strategies to try to manage what was going on. So here's examples over the 6-month period how these coping strategies actually, the reduction of food consumption, that's above 80% of the population was engaging in that. Around 30% were taking children, we're following negative financial strategies, selling or consuming productive assets. Again, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the population. Pulling kids out of school. So as I said before, social capital really comes out really strong as something that people are engaged in, particularly in the beginning. But, when I was in Nepal, I don't know, was it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago? I can't remember. They were talking about the earthquake that hit there, and they said that in the beginning, social capital was the most important thing that allowed people to kind of rally and support each other. But you use that stock up after a couple of months. And then it becomes very difficult to use it in the future. And so what we have to understand is that some things that work very effectively in the beginning actually may not be available to you later on. That's why you need to track this stuff over time. You can't, if you only went in once, you'd say, oh, social capital is the most important thing, and that's what we should be focused on. But by the third month, nobody had any social capital left to turn to. Okay, so as I said, it's only reliable strategy in the early months of the shock. Eventually becomes eroded, so then you start seeing these downstream impacts where people are turning to some of this negative stuff that I've been talking about. So as the food security situation deteriorated over time, people started pulling their children out of school. They were sending them off to go work, or they were sending them off to go somewhere else. It had a long-term negative effect on the human capital in the area. I already talked about this breakdown in governance systems that was happening. And I think that that's an important thing to understand. If you are trying to get people to rely on their own informal safety nets, and you don't understand how that governance system is critical to that, how the clan leaders are critical to make sure that that redistribution happens. And if they're not in place, then that redistribution doesn't happen. What was also happening in Jijiga is that you could see that people were still strained by the safety strategies that they were engaged in, and this came very strongly out of the qualitative work, is that quarrels between spouses started going up, and then you actually started to see increased divorce rates. A lot more domestic violence was happening. People migrating, the men were migrating with the animals or migrating for work somewhere outside, and the people that were left behind were the ones experiencing most of the negative shocks, stresses. So the children, the elderly, and the women were often negatively affected because of the downstream impacts, because they were the ones that were remaining behind in the villages. And so they were actually much more vulnerable. So we were trying to look at, okay, what would resilience look like in relationship to this drought? So what we're basically interested in is, in the face of these shocks and stresses, are people able to maintain certain levels of food security? Do they recover quickly from the shock? So what we found was the food security does change over time in these places. In the Barana region, which was hit by 2 successive droughts, the food security deteriorated over time, almost every month. It got worse. Whereas in Jijiga, the food security actually didn't get too bad. And it was because the drought shock wasn't that big the second round in Jijiga. And so it didn't have as big of an effect. So what I'm trying to say is that it's really important to track this stuff over time so you can see whether these shocks have a cumulative effect, whether one drought and another drought after it actually make big difference in people's ability to manage. We also can see that children were negatively impacted as if the animals are not being able to produce milk, or if they're diseased and you're cutting out a big supply of milk, the children are the ones that are going to mostly suffer in these pastoral groups. Women were finding it very difficult to feed people because they were spending so much time looking for water and actually wood. And so they were spending hours and hours out trying to find stuff to cook with or for water, and as a result, they had less time to take care of the kids, so it had a negative effect on that. And they didn't have as many opportunities for income-generating activities either because they were too busy doing all these other domestic chores. So overall, it looks like about 1/3 of the households were resilient to the first wave of the drought, 26% in Barana and 48% in Jijiga. And the reason I want to point this out is that Jijiga had 2 different kinds of livelihood systems that were different than Barana. It had much more people that were not engaged in agriculture or livestock rearing, so non-pastoralists. So they were in a different risk environment that wasn't as exposed to the climate change as the pastoralists were. The second thing that's important here is that the drought wasn't as significant or wasn't as big, wasn't as severe in the Jijiga area as it was in the Barana area. So the pastoralists in the Barana area were less likely to be resilient than the agropastoralists, and the agropastoralists were less likely to be resilient than the non-pastoralists. So again, one of the reasons why you collect information on livelihood diversity to try to capture livelihoods that are in different risk environments is this illustrates that very, very well. That if you're not exposed to the same climatic shocks, you might be able to manage it more effectively than if you are exposed to the same climatic shocks. So we wanted to know whether or not household resilience, drought exposure, and pre-drought resilience capacity made a difference. In other words, those people that had more capacities, were they able to manage this more effectively or not? So again, we had these indices around absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. What we found was people that had higher capacities were able to manage the shocks more effectively, particularly absorptive capacity. That made a big difference. So the measures of shock exposure employed, whether based on agroclimatic conditions or household's own perception of exposure to the drought, again, what we found was it held up across these different measures. Absorptive capacity, if you had high absorptive capacity, you were able to manage it. There was, analysis found no impact of absorptive capacity on resilience in Jijiga. And the reason that is that absorptive capacity in Jijiga was low from the beginning. It wasn't as high as it was in the Barana area, but they weren't as exposed to severe drought conditions as they were in Barana. But what was important, and again, I want to emphasize why the size of the sample makes a difference. We only had 430 households as part of this panel survey. The transformative and adaptive capacity was this close to being significant. If we would have had 50 more households probably in the sample, it would have shown up as significant. What I'm trying to say is that you have to be clear about what you're trying to capture and what you're going to be measuring in terms of significance by the sample size. It makes a difference. We weren't interested only in the capacities themselves, but we wanted to know what were the individual activities that people engaged, the different kinds of factors that might have influenced people's ability to manage the shocks and stresses more effectively. When we disaggregated the indices, we found that bonding and bridging social capital across all measures of shocks made a huge difference. That access to informal safety nets also made a big difference in people's ability to manage these shocks. Investment in human capital, things like skill building and trying to make sure that education levels are maintained, made a huge difference. So if you've got a strategy of pulling your kids out of school, and that one shows up as an important way to manage these shocks, that's kind of telling. Access to financial services also made a difference. Access to markets. People that had better access to markets were able to manage these shocks more effectively. And access to natural resource, communal resources. Managing those communal resources made a difference. Now, what does this say in terms of what the program is engaged in, the PRIME project? Well, it tells you that any kind of activity that creates groups that have some kind of functional effect, whether it be village saving and loans groups or credit groups or market groups, it can have a spin-off effect of building social capital. And so what we are asking the PRIME project is to look carefully at these groups formations you have, see if they have different functions, other functions than what you actually created them for. Are they helping each other out? Access to informal safety nets. We already know that when the clan leaders tell everybody they need to redistribute in these areas, it makes a difference for protecting the elderly and the poor. Human capital. Being able to diversify into a different risk environment. That's really important to be able to manage these shocks and stresses. Access to markets. Again, being able to have an alternative income source that allows you to manage the shock more effectively. And managing natural resources. That makes a big difference too. The collective action for managing natural resources makes a difference. So the other thing we're trying to understand is, do these capacities make a difference in people being able to manage and not turn to these negative coping strategies. So what we found was, from the regression analysis, that all three dimensions of resilience capacity did help prevent households from reducing their food consumption. So if you had high levels of absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity, you were less likely to cut down on your food consumption. In Verana, we found that adaptive and transformative capacity helped people prevent them from depleting their productive assets. That transformative capacity enabled them to not undermine their human capital by pulling their children out of school. So resilience capacity had less of a preventive effect in Jijiga than in Verana, but we think it's because the capacities in Jijiga were lower than they were in Verana in the first place. So when we look at the use of coping strategies over the total 6-month period, we see that there's strong evidence that both adaptive and transformative capacity enabled people to keep their children in school, prevented them from sending them from going off to do work, and it allowed them to not to employ negative financial strategies, in other words, get into debt from a money lender. The adaptive capacity helped them not turn to cutting down their food consumption, which actually also has a long-term negative effect on people. So in conclusion, I know I'm probably going to here. Majority of the households in this area were not able to maintain their food security in the face of drought. They were not necessarily resilient to the drought. In other words, remember I said 30% in Verana, 27% in Verana and 48% in Jijiga were able to do that. That these absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacities did make a difference in helping people buffer themselves from the drought, but it's not enough. If you're exposed to 2 big shock waves, it's not going to be enough. And then for most households, these capacities weren't enough to maintain the food security levels, but it prevented them from engaging in these negative coping strategies. And so that's a new insight we gained from this monitoring thing that we haven't been thinking about in terms of measuring resilience. If we can prevent people from turning to these negative coping strategies, then they're more resilient than those people that do turn to those negative coping strategies. Even though their food security still might be lower than it was before, if they don't have to turn to things that are going to sacrifice their future, then I think we're building resilience. But the thing that I really want to drive home here is this. You can't talk about building capacity for managing shocks and stresses without understanding the importance of social protection. If you don't have, we got the trigger indicators that tell us that things are getting worse. We are tracking things over time. We see that people's coping strategies are eroding. If we don't have a timely social protection intervention, it has to be at the right time, in the right duration, at the right level. If you don't have that, then you're going to lose all of your investment. And so we need to be thinking about how is the best way to implement emergency programming or social protection in a timely way using a resilience lens. And so that's why it's so important to get this right. There were a lot of programs being implemented by PS&P and by others, but it wasn't effective. PS&P was supposed to have 6 distributions. They only had 2. The other NGOs that were operating in the area, they went on kind of one-off support in terms of cash or a food transfer. You can actually see a blip in the food security change, but that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to prevent them on this downward pathway. So understanding these pathway dynamics, both in terms of shocks and people's responses, is critical to know when the timing has to be, when do you release the resources, how long do you release the resources, and what level do you release those resources? If we can get that right, then our chances of building resilience are going to be much better. You should not think of it as losing the battle because you actually provided resources like that. You actually are protecting your investments, just like you would have insurance to protect you when you lose your job, or you have insurance that protects you from, in the United States, from crop failure or animal disease. We have insurance for everything. Okay, and so it's important to understand that same dynamic here. You have to protect your investments. Okay, I think I'm done. One last point before we open up for questions. It's important to, we hadn't been trying this anywhere before, so we're learning as we go. And there are certain things we realized we should have had in the questionnaire that we didn't have in the questionnaire, so we made an adjustment in the next round in terms of things we're asking about. We also realized that asking people questions every month is a little bit too much, and you can know there's a good indicator of that when one household pulled out an AK-47 and said, "I'm done talking." So that was a trigger. That was a trigger indicator. That's right. So we've spread the survey out now for every 2 months instead of on a monthly basis. So we're going to be collecting the data over a whole year. And the other reason why you want to do that is because you have to look at these shocks on a seasonal basis over a whole year period, and how that actually reveals itself and how it plays out over the whole year. So that's why we're doing it. This next round is going to be every 2 months for 1 year. Okay, I'm open for questions. Yeah.
So thank you so much. It's a fascinating presentation, and it's really interesting to see the way you were able to use the data to confirm a lot of different ideas about the way shocks work. One of the things I thought was that a lot of it, so if you've been exposed to 2 droughts, you're going to have more trouble than if you've only been exposed to 1. If you had a better capacity or you had some more resources, it's going to be easier for you than if you had fewer of those things. Those are all pieces that it's great to have the data, but it sort of confirms the way we think about these problems.
Sure.
Was there anything that totally surprised you that was completely counterintuitive? Wasn't what we would have expected given the way we define these problems and think about them?
I guess one thing that I really admired about these households and communities is how effective they were in the early parts of the survey, in the first 2 or 3 rounds of the survey, in managing things. And, by the 4th or 5th round, you start to see things start to unravel. That's when you start seeing the quarrels in the families start to break out, the people kind of not showing up at the market anymore because they were tired of people asking them for money. You start to see the breakdown in the kind of the social bonds that exist in these places over time. People migrate out so that they don't have to be asked for loans anymore. So that part was very interesting to watch it actually play out. The other thing that's important here too is that there were activities. So for example, Mercy Corps had a crisis modifier that they were actually implementing to try to deal with this. But the problem is that they were trying to distribute fodder because there was a huge fodder shortfall. But because of AID contract requirements, they had to bid for this, and the bidding process took so long. By the time they actually released the resources, it was too late. You already had a lot of animals die off, or they didn't make it. So, it's important to really look at I guess one thing I really liked about this study was it really helped me understand better the timing, the duration, and the level that needed to be in place for that social safety net or social protection mechanism to work more effectively. And if you don't have the timing right, or it's not of the right duration, or at the right level, it's not going to make any difference. It's kind of a waste of resources.
Thanks, Tim. That was, as always, amazing. First, let me compliment you and Laura on your seemingly coordinated footwear. It's really, really unusual to see that. Now, I'm just curious. Given the nature of your study and the limited sample size and that limited statistical analysis, I have sort of 2 questions based on that. One is, and they're related, don't worry. One is, I would guess that actually the most interesting thing would be the change in the rates, up and down of food security over time, not the trend, but the actual changes. Right. And I would even guess the second order derivative of that would even be even more interesting if you could do that statistically. I don't know if you can. So if you had a larger sample size, you could definitely do that, and then that would really get at what some of these different things are.
No, I think we were limited on the sample size because of costs.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
And we wanted to have a bigger sample, but we were told no. So.
Well, that's sad. And then the other one is, and the other one which is related is you found different kinds of access to stuff, right? Informal safety nets, whatever. It was interesting that formal safety net didn't help. I like that, by the way. But all those different accesses, did you look at the effect of each one? Were you able to parse that out with the data you had? To see which access had more effect and less had?
Well, what you could actually see is whether the food security was going up or down over time. Mm-hmm. And when you had like a big influx of redistribution, was stable, and when that broke down, it went down. Or when there was an influx of cash or food from an NGO or the government, you could see things kind of stabilize or go up a little bit, and then they go down again because it wasn't for long enough. It wasn't enough. So that part I think is important to understand. But that's not what we're trying to do in this study, but it was an insight that came out of the study. And this importance of governance, that was the other thing that kind of surprised me. You asked me about that. When the clan leaders are there, things seem to go a lot better than when they're not. And so people can force people to redistribute their animals. They can force people to take care of the elderly. They can make sure that the kids are all taken care of in terms of milk supplies. But then when those guys leave, nobody's accountable after that. They don't spontaneously step up to the plate and somebody else takes over. It's pretty much leadership driven by that. So when that governance system starts to break down, it actually is. That's when people are really, really vulnerable. And I don't think we had a good understanding of that until we actually looked at it over time. We just think everybody's vulnerable from the beginning, but they aren't so vulnerable until that breaks down.
So you talked about the the quote negative coping strategies of reducing food consumption, taking children out of school, so on and so forth. For the folks or the households that didn't engage in those strategies, what did they do instead? And then kind of relatedly, did you guys do kind of an in-depth analysis of the resilience, or is that kind of a future plan of like? Future plan.
Yeah. Okay. But the ones that weren't turning those negative coping strategies still had resources that they could rely on. They had savings. They had maybe even an alternative income source. So they had a better set of capacities to manage it than those that didn't have as many capacities. They turned to that negative stuff much faster. So
the strategies were driven by the resources that households had.
A lot of it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Tom.
Again, I just really appreciate all that you've shared about this. It's interesting to see how the study has evolved, I think, from when it was first designed to really refine it quite a bit. And it's really interesting from a resilience measurement standpoint to understand more clearly the why, what is resilience, what tools can we bring to bear, what sources of data to measure it, what does it look like. Drawing on what's been analyzed so far, I'd be really interested to hear more on the how, like how has the project applied some of this information from a project design to use differences in context of differences in resilience capacity to do that layering, sequencing, and integration that we talked about.
Well, all I know is I had a phone call with the project while I was in Nairobi. Where was I? No, I was in Rome. It was an hour and a half. They had all of their team leaders on the call, and we kind of went through each of these things, what the implications were. And I knew a little bit about what the project was trying to do because we also, through another project, are really looking at the interventions that the project's trying to promote. And so, so I could bring up like, oh, well, I know you're doing this. This probably is related to improving people's access to financial services. You should look at that a little bit more carefully because it looks like it's really an important thing to take into account. Or you're building all these groups. Have you actually looked to see if those groups are actually doing other things than what you built them for? Are they only a market group, or do they actually try to help each other as well in other ways? So one of the things that we've noticed in other studies that we've done is when a group is formed for one purpose, but then it takes on other functions, that's when you start to see more resilience happening in the area. So, and AID has actually seen this happen in several projects where they might bring women together, whether it be a water management group or a credit group, but then these groups actually start doing other things, more collective action around other things. And that's when you start to see real resilience happening. So that's why I think Mercy Corps definitely was taking a relook at what it was investing in and trying to understand how those different interventions might actually be tweaked to strengthen. John.
Thanks, Tim. So as usual, you helped unpack kind of the right-hand side of the equation here of around what matters, so what types of access to resources, human capital, financial capital. I think that's new insight and kind of adds to the baseline story for sure. What I saw you do, so for practitioners, I think that's super helpful, and certainly for the team there in Ethiopia. What I saw you do here that was new that I think policymakers would be keen on, but maybe seems like a quite bold statement. You've actually sort of made a claim about the left-hand side to say 26% in Borana were resilient versus 48 in Jijiga. Just want to hear a bit more about how you landed on that, given that, you know, as we discussed, it's not sort of a yes or no question.
Right. Right.
And even if it was, what's the basis of that? Of if you're saying you didn't have any change in your food security based on an arbitrary baseline point? I mean, what is a normal
It's
food
based
security
on exposure to the shock, the severity of the shock, and still being able to maintain a certain level of food security or recovering quickly. So, for example, maybe in the first drought, which hit both areas really hard, those households in Jijiga that were able to recover quickly are more likely to be resilient than those that didn't recover so fast or still maintain the downward trajectory. And so we were interested not only in being able to maintain a certain level of food security in the face of those shocks, and we definitely knew how severe the shocks were. But if they were able to, if they still went down and then came back really fast, because we were tracking it over time, so we knew how fast they came back up on the food security, then that told us probably that they were probably more resilient, at least in the short term. Now, one of the things that's important here is that it aligned very nicely with livelihood diversity in different risk environments. And so those households that were non-agriculturalists, non-pastoralists, weren't exposed to the same climatic risks as those that were. And so they maintained their food security okay because they weren't so dependent on things that are more climate risk related. Okay, so those guys are more in Jijiga than in Borana. Whereas the Borana guys are totally dependent on, almost all of them are more dependent on having access to good fodder and water, and that goes down because of the climate risk. They're really vulnerable, and they don't have as many alternatives to turn to. But they're a little bit, because they're so mobile, they're able to manage most of it. I think if there was only one drought and the second drought wouldn't have happened, I think they would have pulled out. I think they would have been okay. It was that second downward trend that was so severe, that's really what took them out.
But just as a follow-up, isn't that just saying simply they were worse hit, and therefore, you know, of course their consumption dropped more, versus for those who were equally hit? It's always been kind of a more or less resilient, you know, thing in my mind, versus they are or they're not.
I guess what I want to make sure everybody understands is that just because you're building capacity to manage shocks and stresses, you have to take the severity of the shock and the combinations of shocks into account to know whether or not somebody can actually manage that. And, you know, if we're true to ourselves, if you're really hit hard twice, you know, no matter what capacity you have, you probably aren't going to be able to make it through the second one. And so that's why you want to, it's kind of like you want to build resilience up to a point where people can manage stuff that normally happens, but when something that's different, like double whammies happen, then you need to have a social protection mechanism in there. You know, and I think that it's kind of like building resilience to the 100-year flood or building resilience to the 20-year flood. You know, what's the investment strategy? Is it do we want to invest in a 100-year drought? You know, that's a lot of money that you would have to put into an area to make people be able to manage that effectively. You know, so you have these trade-offs. Do you make them able to manage the 30 or 40-year drought, but then you have social protection that kicks in if it's worse than that? You know, that's the way I like to think about it. You know, you can't. It's not worth it to try to make everybody resilient to the 100-year drought. Yeah, Chris.
This is related to what you're kind of saying now, but I wonder, I'm assuming that the time series was so short that you might not have been able to detect this, but I'm wondering whether you were. You said that Mercy Corps was taking a look at their activities in the light of this information, and maybe make some adjustments to help improve security. But I wonder if changes at the household level in them sort of adjusting their livelihood security strategy in the face of these multiple shocks. I ask the question because I'm not a food security specialist, but I see a situation like Ethiopia where it seems sort of fundamentally unsustainable given current climate change trends, population trends, and we're making all these tactical adjustments, but the long-term strategy really needs to be adjusted. And, their traditional livelihoods maybe just aren't going to make it over the long term. And I know that even in the context of Food for Peace and other USAID and other donor initiatives, that people are looking at alternative livelihoods that have nothing to do with traditional livelihoods. But I don't know how much of that message is getting through at the council.
Well, and there's been a lot of people looking at, in fact, this project is looking at people leaving pastoralism and trying to create opportunities for them to improve their skills. The chances of working in urban areas goes up. You have a better chance. So there's a big part of this project that is focused and understands that leaving pastoralism is part of the strategy to adapt. But, there's other things that you want to make sure we don't lose track of, and that's, is there ways to make those populations better adapted in those situations while you're waiting for that transition? I think if everybody's forced to leave, all of a sudden, then it becomes a huge burden on the part of those urban areas to manage them.
You're right. No, I think it has to be incremental and iterative over time. But I just didn't know if you were seeing any evidence in your data of people, sort of starting to back slowly away from their pastoralism, for example, looking at other, complementing or other livelihood sources of income.
Anybody from Mercy Corps want to speak to that? David?
I don't think I can beat the result we've seen from the program, so I'm not close enough to it. I would say that the team is having to respond quite a lot to, frankly, there's pressures from the government making it pretty hard to do the same number anyway. So that transition is really increasing in so it's a very real part of the program strategy process. I understand that from the design point of view now, the policy environment has changed a lot. That becomes more and more of a core part of the program.
Yeah, right along with this conversation, I was curious if Mercy Corps or Kim, you had any information or any observations about the role of remittances in some of that change that we just spoke of. And it seemed that, I think that there's parts of that region that a lot of people are not involved in other places to work.
Well, one thing that came out very strongly when we pulled the indices apart and we looked at the individual factors, bridging social capital really made a difference. And bridging social capital is where you have somebody in another location, different risk environment that's providing resources back to you. That could be a relative that moved to the urban area or moved even to the States and is sending resources back. And that across the board was a very important strategy enabling people to manage shocks and stress. Yeah?
There was a bunch of questions online, but the first one, and everyone else is asking more questions. For the sake of everyone's understanding, can you potentially explain how exactly food security was defined so that it is the main indicator?
Well, food security is one of those elusive concepts that you need multiple indicators to actually capture. And so we wanted indicators that changed rapidly. Okay, so diet diversity changes rapidly under these conditions. Also, people's perceptions of how they're doing actually changes rapidly. That's why this HSIAS was being used. So we found that to be a very robust indicator of food security. It kind of looks at people's worry about their ability to meet their food consumption needs over time as things get worse. So we found that to be a very good one. But in the actual baseline and end-line surveys, we're looking at a lot more different indicators to capture that. It's just that Some of these indicators change a little bit more slowly than others. So in 5 years, you will see changes in some of them, but in 1 month to the next month, you may not with some of these indicators. So that's why as part of your monitoring system, you're capturing a dimension of food security that changes rapidly. But you wouldn't track, for example, stunting in this. Yeah.
I'm sorry, maybe.
Oh, you had another question?
So, can we do maybe one in person, one online question?
Okay. You're in
Just
person.
real quickly then, so you've said a couple times that the difference between the two regions, the two areas, was that one was, Jijiga, I think, was at a lower level of food security than...
No, it was higher.
Higher than, okay.
But at first, okay, in the baseline, Jijiga had less absorptive, adaptive, and transformative capacity than Verona did.
So those were the measures.
Yeah. But in terms of the shocks, Jijiga wasn't hit as hard by the second wave of shocks as Verona was.
Right.
So even if you had more capacity, if you're nailed by a big enough, severe enough shock, it eventually kind of doesn't work.
So the measures you were using for that then were adaptive capacities, different capacities?
Yeah. So what's important here is understanding the dynamic between the severity and duration of shocks, the downstream effects of those shocks, the dynamic in terms of what people do first to manage the shock, second to manage the shock, before they turn to these negative coping strategies, and the outcome measures that actually get worse over time if they're not able to manage it effectively. And so you're tracking all these dimensions in a very dynamic way is what I'm saying. It's not a static picture. Things are moving.
Right, I was just wondering about that starting point when you said, and the starting point, the measures were capacities.
Well, the starting point was the shock, and the baseline captured the capacities.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Exactly. Thanks.
Yeah.
Another one online. Does the interim monitoring surveys, IMS, include any sex-disaggregated data that tells us something about gender and coping strategies?
Yes. We still, one change that we need to do in the report is we need to have several more tables that analyze it. So that's our next round of revisions. These things are never ending. Yes.
Yeah, I thought you had a great point about the downstream effects along with kind of the initial shock effects. So those are two different things. In trying to measure resilience and defining who's resilient and who's not, goes a little bit, I think, at John's point. How do you differentiate in your measurement with the second group that was still having the downstream effects from the first drought and then experienced the second shock? So if their initial kind of capacities are reduced because of the downstream effects of the first one, that take into account in your measurement and your analysis to say their resilience to the second shock may have been better than actually recorded because their capacities were reduced by the downstream effects.
Absolutely, I think. Yeah, one of the issues. Okay, this is an important point. One of the issues that we have when we do these surveys is, ideally it would have been great if we would have went in and measured that whole questionnaire over again, at least on the first round of the monitoring, so that you could actually see how the capacities are changing over time. But that's a huge burden on those households to collect that data. And one of the things we were trying to do in the discussions around measuring resilience was look for ways to slim down that survey, so that, it was such a burden on the households that you would collect this data from and collect things more frequently. But what we're realizing is there are sacrifices there. If you don't continue to collect that, at least some minimum level of these capacities over time, then you're not going to capture that eroding of the capacities over time. And so we're seriously thinking about going back and collecting that data in the next month, but I definitely worry about those AK-47s.
Can I just speak to that point and offer a potential suggestion? So some people know I'm a psychologist by training, and sometimes what we do is actually take the indicator within a scale that just kind of is the strongest indicator, and then use that.
Just collect on that.
Yeah, just collect on that. So for example, there's a very common self-esteem scale. It's 12 questions long, and it works almost just as well to ask people, what is your self-esteem? And so you could ask 12 questions, or you can just ask that one question. So one, within the scale, there you can just look at the coefficients and say, like, this one explains most of the variance in the scale, or you can just ask a question that gets at the notion of adaptive capacity, and it's not perfect, right? But at least you have your measure across time, and it's only 3 questions as opposed to 36.
And we've actually done the analysis on trying to look at the various indicators that we use to construct these indices and identify which ones are actually accounting for most of the variance. So we could do that, and we probably should do that.
I'll speak a little bit to that. I don't think we're quite there yet in terms of like having enough information to identify what that question is.
Well, they did the analysis.
Yeah, we did.
Oh, yeah, I know. I'm saying in terms of data points to identify that one the question.
No, the reason I was reluctant to actually jump to those few was that I was afraid that, like, we presented this as interaction, and I was afraid that by doing that, people that are going to be trying this somewhere else would just jump to those 3, and they wouldn't collect the rest of it. That was kind of important, and those elements might be more important in a different place. And so I was kind of reluctant to kind of give them the streamlined version too fast. You know, it made sense where we were, but maybe won't make sense in Northern Kenya, or wouldn't make sense in West Africa. And so we're learning. Yeah. All right.
So this is a brilliant study that gives us a really good sense of what is happening with these populations for this shock. And I'm wondering, because we all know that context is really important for all of this, is there any intent at this point that you're aware of to expand this type of work into more project areas, so outside of Ethiopia, sort of maybe other donors? And then I'm also wondering from the implementer side, if you can give a bit of a sense of there's no real good politically correct way to ask this, but this is a significant investment of donor resources as well as partner resources, and I'm wondering if you can sort of give a sense of, from a time and resources perspective, on the part of the implementing partner, as partners are thinking through how they might be able to benefit from this or partner on something like this in the future, sort of the scale of resources and time that you're looking at to try to get at some of that balance of context is really important, but resources are finite.
Sure. Okay, so the first question you asked, are we trying this in other places? Yes, we will be having something like this modified probably in Zimbabwe and in West Africa and possibly Nepal. So that's the first answer to that. And then Mercy Corps has already been trying it in some other places, kind of a scaled down version of it. The second comment is that the actual interim monitoring survey doesn't cost that much. What costs a lot is the baseline. Okay, so if you don't have all that data that you can panel up to, then it's very expensive to collect this detailed data like this second, third, fourth time. So you have to look at, so for example, you guys are involved in a lot of baselines, so you could build off baselines that are being collected, which costs a lot of money. But then you could set up these monitoring systems associated with those baselines. So the actual cost of the monitoring was not very much at all, actually, in relationship. It's like if you could spend $120,000 to set the system up. Okay, so what costs, as I said, is the baseline and the inline. That's where the big money is. Now, as we are in greater demand for additional information that would help us do better analysis, particularly on how these capacities erode over time, then we're going to have to increase the cost probably by adding more stuff to the questionnaire. And if we think that the sample size needs to be increased too, then that will increase the price too. So there are all these trade-offs. You know, I think even though we only had 430 households, I think we had a lot to say with that 430 households. But I would have loved it if those transformative adaptive capacity significances would have been higher. You know. So, yeah. Yeah.
So Roslyn wanted to ask, did this project work on tapping into, say, cultural knowledge of drought among the Ethiopians to see how that might have influenced or encouraged the results of this finding, and the role it might have also played in developing or not developing?
Yeah, I think we try to tap into that because we're asking people themselves what shocks were they exposed to and how severe were those shocks. So that's tapping into their cultural knowledge about this stuff. I'm glad you brought that point up because I wanted to make another point on the basis of that. When you're asking people, okay, so what shocks are you exposed to 6 times in a row? They don't always say it's drought, 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 drought. They go, it's whatever they're experiencing at the time. So first it's the drought, then it's the animal diseases, and then it's the terms of trade. They don't call it terms of trade. They said I'm not getting much value for my selling of my animals. And then they start talking about conflict. Okay, so each round, what became significant to them was the current shock they were experiencing, which was a downstream effect of the first one. Whereas we knew that it was all related to the drought and that they were actually going through another drought. So that perception is really important to pick up on what they're trying to struggle with and deal with at the time. Yeah.
And just some of the sampling that I may have misunderstood this in the beginning. Your full sample for the study, the baseline is
3,200.
3,200. Was this just a random pull, the 400? So
No.
The second question being, why wouldn't you just, especially if you're having nutrition issues, why wouldn't you just pull a new sample, sub-sample 400 every month so you don't beat down the same household?
Because we wanted
to be a panel.
Because we wanted to actually see how those households were dealing with this thing over time. Okay, we did. So the next round, this next year, is a completely new sample because we don't want to overburden them 2 years in a row. But
The same panel of correct.
yeah, but the same panel. We really wanted to know what the households themselves were doing through time. You know, so that we could actually understand that dynamic.
And then I guess one more thought, one more question on other ways to replicate this. This IMS was a much shorter survey, so like 15 minutes. Is that something that could be done remotely at potentially lower cost?
You mean like with cell phones?
Cell phones?
Maybe. Maybe. Some of these areas, the cell phone connection's not so good. You know, you have to kind of stand on the highest hill.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions, and then if we come to
In other places, it probably would work with cell phones. Yeah. I think that's what NBAM does with WP, yeah? They actually use cell phones in Iraq and places that are kind of dangerous for certain.
Yeah, so I think the primary goal of your collecting this data is for you to inform a program so that they can change what they are doing to help the community. But I was wondering whether you also had in mind of feeding back the information that you're collecting to the community so that they prepare ahead of time. For example, you talked about collecting weather-related data that you get from the satellite source. How do you communicate that back to the
project itself actually has a component that works with villages to provide them climate data on a regular basis. Okay, so they're feeding that information back. You know, whether it be the rainfall data from the government or FEMSNet information. Yeah, David.
One of our operating assumptions at Mercy Cosmo is that if we want to set up these measuring processes, that it's really helpful that before we do a baseline, we sort of can
grapple with, develop some kind of theory of resilience in that context, right? So the baseline, that's baked into the baseline. That wasn't really done. Do you, from your perspective, do you think that the baseline would have been stronger and able to contribute to this better had we gone into it with a theory of change like that, or do you think the baseline is sufficient?
Oh, I'm a big believer in the theory of change driving what we actually flash. So, yeah, it would have been much better if we would have had that. But, there's a little bit of a theory of change with regards to these capacities anyway. You're assuming that if you strengthen these things, it will make a difference. And it looks like it does, but
Those capacities weren't pre-identified in prime design, right? We sort of gone back in retrospective, we look at baseline and saying, well, we hit a bunch of capacities. They weren't in there at the beginning.
That's right.
If I could speak to that, not when Prime was designed, but having been involved in earlier iterations of that baseline, I think the whole approach to resilience measurement in itself has been refined quite a bit. So at that time, and what we were doing that I think was innovative for the baseline design, if not the Prime design, was really looking at the interplay in Ethiopia between household resilience and community resilience. And so the design for doing that at both levels was, I think, new at the time. And to actually try to complement some quantitative indicators or qualitative indicators with respect to different capacities. Now, it's gone beyond that. It's been refined, but I think the baseline, that was a good start.
Wasn't me telling you it's time to go, Tim.
Hello.
You want me to hang up?
Yeah, we're just wrapping up this meeting.
Maybe she's got a question.
Oh, and then we'll wrap up.
I just got to add on to that resilience thing. I mean, the work you did in Nepal earlier this year in designing a module for resilience is feeding directly into the baseline studies that ICF, and I'm working for ICF, for the baseline studies for the Food for Peace award. So, I mean, I think that's a great example. Hopefully we'll get some good info out of that, because it was, you front-ended it with the module. We'll come in with a 7,000 household sample and hopefully have some good data as a result.
Yeah, I think what's important here is that we create these learning opportunities, recognize when we could have done something a little bit better, and share that with so somebody else doesn't make the same mistake we did. And I'm glad that there's these kind of forums that we can share this stuff, because if we don't learn from our mistakes as we go, we're just going to be doomed to repeat them.
Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing this and taking the time on your way back.
Why you should